The alleged plot to shoot up that hotel, targeting workers and guests, and the suspect was charged and in court just moments ago. Tonight, new details coming in about the alleged plot. The hotel cook arrested, the arsenal seized at his home, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, an AR-15 among the weapons. And this all comes amid two more cases today. Two young people arrested for alleged threats to open fire at school with the school year just underway. But we begin with that hotel plot in California, and ABC's Will Carr leads us off.
Tonight, the man accused by authorities of plotting America's next massacre appeared in court for the first time. 37-year-old Rodolfo Montoya behind that glass divider, now charged with 4 felonies. Police say they found a stash of weapons inside Rodolfo Montoya's home, including hundreds of rounds of ammunition, tactical gear, and an assault rifle and high-capacity magazines. Both are illegal in California.
A day of national pride for Iran. The unveiling of its own long-range surface-to-air missile defense system, the Bavar 373. After years of sanctions that stopped Iran from importing many weapons, it's had to develop its own domestic arms industry. And now facing a military build-up in the region, President Hassan Rouhani is defiant.
Now that our enemies do not accept logic, we cannot respond with logic. When the enemy launches a missile against us, we cannot give a speech and say, "Mr. Rocket, please do not hit our country and our innocent people." We cannot say, "Mr. Rocket Launcher, please hit a button and self-destruct the missile in the air."
The Bavar 373 can identify up to 100 targets at the same time. Iran's ballistic missile program was not part of the 2015 nuclear deal, a reason cited by the United States for pulling out of the agreement last year and imposing sanctions on Iran.
Peace talks with the Taliban could be making some serious headway. Washington is certainly optimistic about them.
Conversations are going well. The truth will be in the reality. What really happens on the ground? If we can reduce violence, we'll create a space where we can withdraw not only American support, but NATO forces that are there as well.
Reducing violence would be great in a country that's seen 19 years of continuous war. According to the reports, there are 4 key negotiating points at the moment. First, the Taliban must guarantee that it will not allow foreign armed groups to use Afghanistan as a base for their terrorist attacks. An obvious reference to al-Qaeda, which brought the U.S. and its allies to the country in the first place. In return, the U.S. and NATO troops must pull out from Afghanistan. Then there's the questions of a permanent ceasefire and internal political dialogue. And then there's a couple of elephants in the room, like, for example, the future of CIA armed and trained Afghan militias.
Horror in New York City today. A young man crushed to death in an elevator. 2 others had just gotten off. 3 people were standing behind him, still in that elevator, witnessing it all.
An investigation tonight into how a simple elevator ride turned into a deadly tragedy.
Report of an elevator drop with person possibly trapped.
Investigators say 6 people were on board an elevator inside this 22-story Manhattan apartment building when something went terribly wrong. 2 people got off at the lobby, and when 30-year-old Samuel Waisbrand tried to exit, the elevator malfunctioned and suddenly dropped, crushing him to death. Firefighters also rescued 3 more people trapped inside that elevator who witnessed the horror. The building had been fined nearly $1,300 in May for unsafe elevator conditions. Just last year, the cables of an elevator snapped in Chicago, sending 6 people, including a pregnant woman, plunging 84 stories.
The wreck of the Titanic, seen for the first time in over a decade, almost completely covered in deep-sea bacteria feeding on the ship's metal, eroding much faster than expected. The legendary ship inspired an Oscar-winning movie and this iconic scene on the bow. This was the bow 14 years ago. This is the bow today. Those icicle shapes, bacteria. But the famous bathtub in the captain's quarters now hidden under a collapsing deck. The glamorous ship thought to be unsinkable when it set sail from England in 1912 on its maiden voyage to New York. 2 days later, colliding with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. This latest expedition used the highest tech submersible and cameras to study how the ship is now breaking down. The bacteria now turning the ship's 50,000 tons of iron into powder.
It's an act of defiance. People living in the Sura neighborhood of Srinagar have erected these barricades. Unlike the ones put up by security forces to control the movement of local people, these have been put up to keep the security forces out.
They come in violently. The night before Eid last week, they blocked us in from 4 directions and didn't let us pray in our main mosque. They've also arrested boys and girls from other areas, so we have closed off the entrance here.
This neighborhood has been the flashpoint of several protests since restrictions were imposed on movement and communications after the region's autonomy was revoked. People here worry that makes them a target.
If we look at the present situation, it looks like they are going to arrest every one of us.
Ghulam Bhatt's brother was detained on August 9th while returning home from work. His family only learned of his arrest the next day.
Hazina Jakarta hanya memberi uang.
Masa beringas, melempari pangdam.
Untuk teman-teman yang mau orasi silakan naik di panggung. Kami saat saja kami akan nikmati hari ini baik-baik. Karena tidak perlu yang seperti kayak orang lain kayak begitu. Kita di negara mereka, kita Papua. Karena Otus dia punya wewenang dikebiri oleh
Unions in Argentina are pushing for an end to austerity quickly. Less than 2 weeks ago, they celebrated President Mauricio Macri's loss in a primary vote to center-left candidate Alberto Fernandez. Unions are now pressing for austerity measures to be cancelled immediately before presidential elections are held in October. Argentina has been mired in economic crisis, recession episodes, inflation, and rising unemployment for 2 decades. Austerity measures imposed over the past 2 years, since the government took a $57 billion bailout loan from the IMF, have pushed more Argentinians into poverty. It's estimated 1/3 of them are now living below the poverty line.
Well, France 24's Charles Peyrat is in Hong Kong and joins us now. Charles, what are the protesters hoping they're going to achieve today? They're building some sort of a human chain. What's that about?
Absolutely. As you can see behind me, there's this whole line of people on the other side of the street forming this human chain. The goal here is basically to show that the movement is still alive and coming up with new ways to pass its message. And here the message of holding hands over the whole territory of Hong Kong is basically a symbol of unity, that the majority of the people here, according to the protesters, are behind the movement. The goal here is to get 100,000 participants to cover about 33 kilometers of ground. It's also the 30th anniversary of the Baltic Way, which is basically a similar human chain about 30 years ago in the Baltic states in order to demand independence from the Soviet Union.
"400 years ago, the first African slaves arrived on the shores of the United States. Archaeologists are searching for one of the very first to step off the boats, Angelo, a woman who arrived here in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. They're hoping that by finding her remains, they can learn more about African heritage in America. Considered as a foremother of the African American community, historians believe Angelo boarded a ship in Angola before heading to Veracruz and finishing her voyage in Jamestown on the James River. She appears in the colony's census documents in 1624 and 1625. She worked for a wealthy family and lived alongside white servants.